Welcome to Late Night Calm. Tonight, let the day fall away from you like sand slipping through open fingers. There is nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to solve. Just let your breathing slow, let your shoulders sink into whatever is holding you, and let me carry you somewhere very far away and very long ago. A place of red earth and slow rivers, of desert stars and drifting caravans. You don't have to remember any of it, you only have to listen and let the sound of it fold over you like a warm blanket pulled up in the dark. I want you to begin by picturing a single object. Not a king, not a crown, not a mountain of gold, just a slab of salt. A flat, heavy block of it, pale and rough, about the size of a paving stone, cut from the dry floor of a desert mine far to the north. Feel the weight of it in your imagination. It is coarse and grey-white, cool to the touch even in the heat, and if you ran your thumb across its surface, it would leave a faint powdery taste on your skin. It looks like nothing. It looks like rock. And yet, by the time this slab of salt has travelled south across the whole width of the Sahara and down through the dry grasslands, and finally into the green heart of the empire we are visiting tonight, it will be worth something almost impossible to believe. In the far south, in the lands where the gold came out of the ground, that plain grey slab of salt could be traded for something close to its own weight in gold. Let that settle for a moment. Salt, weighed against gold. The thing we sprinkle without thinking, the thing that sits forgotten in a cupboard, was once so precious that men crossed a desert that could kill them to carry it, and other men gave up gold to hold it. Now I should be honest with you here, in the gentle way of these late hours, because the truth is softer and more interesting than the legend. The tidy phrase, ounce for ounce, pound for pound, is really a kind of poetry that has been passed down and repeated for centuries. What was truly happening was simpler and, in its own way, more human. Salt became more valuable the farther south it travelled, because the farther south you went, the harder it was to find, and the more the body needed it. And so, deep in the hot interior, near the goldfields themselves, the value of salt climbed and climbed until it stood almost shoulder to shoulder with the value of gold. The exact ratio nobody can truly promise you. But the strangeness is real. In this world, a block of salt was treasure. And here is why. Think about the body for a moment. Your own body, lying there warm and still. In great heat, when a person works under a hard sun, they sweat, and with that sweat they lose salt, quietly, all day long. The body needs that salt back, or it begins to fail. In the cool wetlands of the north, salt was everywhere, in the sea, in the rock. But in the hot savanna and the deep forests to the south, salt was scarce and precious. And it was needed not only to keep a body alive, but to keep food from spoiling. Salt preserved meat and fish through the long dry months. Salt made survival possible. So a substance that seems humble to us became one of the most valuable things a person could own, and it tied the whole of this vast empire together, like a thread running from the deep desert in the north down to the goldfields in the south. Follow that thread of salt, and you follow the whole story. Because this is the secret we are going to uncover tonight, slowly, level by level, the way you might climb a long staircase in the dark with a candle in your hand. There is one name from this empire that the world remembers. Just one. A king so rich that the stories about him have grown taller than any building. But that king did not make his own wealth. He sat at the very top of a great pyramid of lives, and beneath him were all the others, the invisible ones, the ones whose labour and secrets and fear and memory turned salt and grain and gold into a legend. Tonight we are going to climb from the very bottom of that pyramid all the way to the top. And we are going to start at the bottom, in the dark, with the person who had the least. So let the salt slab drift away for now. We will meet it again. And let me place you, gently, at the lowest rung of the whole empire. Imagine that you have been born or captured into bondage. In the language of these lands, you would be called yon, an enslaved person, and you stand at the very bottom of everything. Tonight your life belongs to a caravan that is forming at the desert's southern edge, and soon it will begin to move north across the Sahara, and you will move with it, on foot, roped in a long line with others like you. I want to be honest and careful here, in the soft way this hour deserves, because this was a real thing that happened to real people, and they deserve to be remembered with dignity and not turned into a horror show. So I will simply tell you the truth of it, plainly, and let it rest. Slavery was woven all through this empire, as it was through much of the world in those centuries. Captives were taken in war, taken in raids, born into servitude, or bought and sold along the trade routes like any other cargo. And across the great desert to the north, over hundreds of years, an enormous number of human beings were carried away from their homes and marched toward the markets of North Africa and the Mediterranean shore. Historians, looking back across the whole long span of that trade, estimate the total in the millions, though those are careful guesses reaching back across centuries. Not numbers anyone counted at the time. What we know for certain is that the road went north, across the sand, and that for someone in your position tonight, it was the hardest road of all. But here is something that may surprise you, something worth holding on to as you drift, because it makes this world more real and less like a simple story of cruelty. Being John did not mean one single fate. Enslaved status in this empire was layered, stratified, uneven. At the bottom were those who did the hardest labor, working the fields under the sun, or, worse still, cutting salt in the desert mines. But an enslaved person might also be a household servant, living close to a wealthy family. And, strangest of all to our ears, an enslaved person might rise to become a soldier, or even a trusted official at the king's own court, holding real power over free-born men. Enslavement passed down from parent to child. Yes, it was heritable, but the life it led to could bend in many directions. Some who began at the bottom ended up standing very near the top. So even here, in the darkest corner of the empire, the picture is not flat. It has depth. It has surprises. Yet tonight, for you, the road is the road north. So let me place you in it, gently, and let the desert do what it does. The caravan gathers in the cool before dawn. You can smell the camels before you see them, that thick, warm, animal smell of dust and hide and dung. And you can hear them too, that deep, groaning complaint they make when they are loaded. A sound like a door swinging on a rusted hinge, low and long. The camels here are the one-humped kind, the dromedary, the great pale ships of the desert, and it was these animals, brought to the Sahara long ago, that made the whole crossing possible in the first place. Without them, no salt would come south, and no gold would go north, and there would be no empire at all. Only scattered villages by the river. A large caravan might number in the hundreds of camels, sometimes more, a slow river of animals and men strung out across the sand. The merchants ride, or walk beside their beasts. The guides, often men of the desert peoples who knew the sand the way you might know the rooms of your own home, walk at the front, reading the land. But you, and the others in bondage, you walk in the line, on foot, the whole way. The rope at your wrists or your neck ties you to the person ahead and the person behind, and you become part of a single long body moving across an emptiness so vast it is hard to hold in the mind. And the desert. Oh, the desert. Let me give it to you slowly, because the desert is a world of its own, and it does not care who you are. By day the sun comes down like a weight, pressing on your head and your shoulders, and the sand throws the heat back up at you from below so that you are cooked from both sides at once. The air shimmers. The horizon melts and lies to you, showing water that is not there. Your lips crack. Salt, that same precious salt, dries white on your skin from your own sweat, and you lick it without thinking, and it does nothing to slake the thirst that becomes the whole of your world. Water is rationed, carried in skins on the camel's flanks, measured out between one well and the next, one oasis and the next. And the distance between them is measured not in the miles we would use, but in days, and in the number of people and animals that can die if a well is missed or found dry. We know all of this not from guesswork, but from a man who actually crossed it and wrote it down. His name was Ibn Battuta, a traveller from far to the north, from Morocco, a restless, curious man who spent his life journeying across the known world. And around the year 1352, he came south across this very desert and into this very empire, and he set down what he saw with his own eyes. He described the fear that hangs over the crossing, the way a guide called the takshif might be sent ahead, racing alone toward the desert-edge town to bring back water and news. He described travellers who wandered from the line and were lost, and travellers who simply died of thirst along the way, their journey ending in the sand. He himself travelled north on one leg of his journeys in a caravan that carried with it hundreds of enslaved women and captives. So when I tell you about the roped line walking north, I am not inventing it to frighten you. It is a thing a real man saw, and it was for someone like you tonight simply the shape of your life. Now, at night, the desert turns on you in the other direction. The moment the sun goes down, the heat drains out of the sand as fast as water out of a cracked cup, and the cold comes in, a bitter, aching cold that seems impossible after the fire of the day. The dark is absolute, the kind of dark that people who live under city lights have never truly known. And overhead, filling the whole black bowl of the sky, the stars. So many stars, so bright and so thick that the guides could steer by them, reading the heavens the way another person reads a map, knowing which star sits where at which hour of which season. So that even in that trackless waste, there was a way to know north from south. Picture that, if it helps you drift. The camels folded down in the cold, groaning softly. The little fires, the endless silver dust of stars, and a line of tired people wrapped against the cold, waiting for the dawn that will bring back the heat they will soon be praying to escape. And where did that road end for a captive walking north? That is a question I am going to leave open for now, hanging in the dark, because we will come back to it later when we climb higher and reach the salt mines themselves. For now, let it simply rest there, unanswered, the way the hardest questions often must. The road goes north. The desert is patient, and somewhere at the end of it is a market and a new life or the end of one. We will follow that thread when the time comes. Let us step back now, out of the caravan, and take in the whole of the land we are travelling through, so that you understand where all of these lives are unfolding. Because we have started at the bottom, but the bottom sits inside something enormous. This is the Mali Empire. The people who built it called their heartland Mandan, or Manding, and they were the Manda peoples, and among them the Malink, or Mandinka. Let those soft names roll past you like slow water. Mandan, Manding, the empire, grew up along the upper reaches of a great river, the Niger, which curves through West Africa like a vast, lazy question mark, and it spread outward from there until, at its height, it stretched more than 2,000 kilometers from one side to the other across the belt of dry grassland and scattered trees that runs beneath the southern edge of the Sahara. This was one of the largest empires anywhere in the world in its day. It controlled the goldfields to the south and the southern ends of all those desert trade routes we just walked, so that the salt coming down and the gold going up both passed, in the end, through its hands. And it began, as these things often do, with a story. A story kept alive for us not in books, but in the mouths and memories of a special kind of people we will meet properly a little later. According to that tradition, the empire was founded by a man named Sundiata Keita. You may also hear his name as Sundiata, and the tale told of him is that he rose up and won a great battle at a place called Kirina, around the year 1235, defeating a rival king, and from that victory the Empire of Mali was born. Now, I want to be gentle and truthful with you about this, the way a good storyteller should be in the quiet hours. The tale of Sundiata is preserved in a great oral epic, sung and recited across the generations, and it is full of magic and sorcery and wonders, a rival king who was a sorcerer, secret weaknesses, prophecies, as literal history, moment by moment. We cannot lean on every detail. But as a cultural treasure, as the living self-portrait of a people, the epic of Sundiata is priceless and true in the deepest way. So we hold it in both hands. The battle at Kirina, around 1235, the founder named Sundiata Keita. These are the roots of the empire we are walking through tonight. And this empire had a shape, not just on the land, but in the way its people lived together. And I want to give it to you now, softly, because it is the frame on which everything else hangs, the whole staircase we are going to climb. Mandi society was ordered broadly into 3 great tiers, and almost everyone belonged to one of them from birth. At the top were the Horan, the free-born. These were the nobles and, far more numerously, the free farmers. The great mass of ordinary people who worked their own land and owed their service upward through their families and their local lords. To be Horan was to be free, to belong, to have a place. Most of the people you would have passed in a village were Horan. Then, set apart in a way that is hard for us to picture, were the Nyamakala. These were the artisan castes, and they were something particular and strange and important. Among them were the blacksmiths, the leather workers, and a remarkable group of oral historians and musicians we will spend real time with later. The ones who carried the memory of the whole society in their heads. The Nyamakala married only within their own groups, blacksmith to blacksmith. And they were both deeply respected and quietly feared because they were believed to handle a kind of hidden power in the world, an occult force, and we will come to understand why. Hold that word gently as you drift, Nyamakala, the ones set apart. And then, at the bottom, the John, the enslaved, where we began tonight. Free-born above, artisan castes to the side and apart, enslaved beneath. Horon, Nyamakala, John, that was the order of the world. And laid across all of it, like light falling through a high window, was religion. And here too the picture is layered and human. Islam was the faith of the court, of the kings and the wealthy merchants and the growing towns along the trade routes. The Mansa and his circle prayed as Muslims, and Ibn Battuta, that traveller who crossed the desert, was full of praise for the devotion he found. He was struck by how carefully the people kept their prayers, how they crowded the mosques on the day of gathering, how even the children were set to memorizing the words of the Quran, so much so that he saw them kept in chains, he wrote, until they had learned their portions by heart, a detail that startled even him. He admired their devotion greatly. And yet the same man was scandalized again and again by things he saw that offended his own foreign notions of how things should be. He was shocked by the freedom that women moved with in public, the ease of them, the way they spoke and were seen. He was troubled by certain foods, certain court rituals, certain customs that struck him as far from proper. And this is worth pausing on, softly, before we sleep. Ibn Battuta was our clearest eyewitness, and we are lucky to have him, but he was an outsider, seeing this world through the lens of his own faraway home, and the things that shocked him tell us as much about him and his expectations as they do about Mali. When he was scandalized by the freedom of Malian women, that was his discomfort, not their failing. So we take his eyes gratefully, but we remember whose eyes they were. And out beyond the towns, in the countless villages along the river and across the grassland where most people lived, the faith of the court blended with something older. The rural majority, the farmers and herders and fishers, wove the new religion together with the long-held spiritual practices of the Mande world. The beliefs about that hidden power in things, about the spirits of the land, about the vital force that ran through words and iron and living creatures. Islam of the court and the older Mande ways of the countryside living side by side, layered one over the other, neither fully erasing the other. That, too, is the shape of the empire. So here is where we stand, at the close of this first stretch of our long, slow journey. We have held a slab of salt and learned that it could weigh against gold. We have walked, roped in a line, into the great killing desert at the very bottom of the human order. And we have felt the heat of the day and the bitter cold of the star-filled night, and we have left, hanging open in the dark, the question of where that road finally ends. And we have stepped back to see the whole of it, the empire of Mali along the upper Niger, born from the story of Sunjata Keita and the battle at Kirina, ordered into the free-born Horon, the set-apart Nyamakala, and the enslaved John, its court at prayer, and its villages keeping the older ways. But we have only just begun to climb. Above the enslaved captive on the desert road, there is another life waiting, closer to the earth, closer to the rains and the river. The free farmer, the Horon, the great mass of ordinary people, bound not by ropes, but by the seasons, betting their whole survival each year on whether the rains would come when they should. And it is toward that life, toward the red earth and the green shoots of grain, toward the iron hoe and the flooding river, that we will turn next. Still slowly, still gently, in no hurry at all. Let the desert cool behind you now. Let the caravan walk on without you into the dark, and let your breath go long and easy as we prepare to come down, at last, out of the sand and into the green. But not quite yet. Before the sand cools all the way behind us, before the green pulls us forward, sit for one more breath with the people we are leaving on that road. Because it would be easy, from up here, from the safe distance of a story, to imagine that the word for them meant one single thing, that to be John, to be enslaved in Mali, was to be one kind of person, in one kind of place, doing one kind of work until you died. It wasn't. And the truth of it is stranger and softer at the edges than you might expect. Think of the word the way you'd think of a great house with many floors. At the very bottom, in the dark, was the labour we have already walked beside, the captive in the field, the captive at the mine, the one whose whole life was bent to the ground, to the hoe, to the salt, whose days were measured out by someone else, and whose body was, in the plainest and most terrible sense, counted as wealth that could be moved and sold and carried north. That was the floor, that was the cold stone under everything. But climb a little inside that same word, and the light changes, because some who were called John did not spend their lives in a field at all. Some carried spears. Some stood in the ranks of the Mansa's own soldiers, armed, trusted, fed, sent to fight. Some kept the accounts, ran the errands of power, moved close to the ear of a governor or a king. Their status was still bound. They were still, by the order of that world, not free in the way the Horon farmer was free. And yet a captive soldier with a weapon in his hand and the king's business to do lived a life so far from the roped line in the desert that the two could scarcely see each other across the distance. Same word. Same rung, on paper. Two lives that barely touched. That is a hard thing to hold, and I want you to hold it gently, the way you'd hold something fragile in the dark, and not squeeze. It does not soften the road. The road was still real, the rope was still real, the desert still killed the careless and the unlucky, and the ones simply born at the wrong place in the line. But it tells you that the empire was not a single, flat cruelty. It was layered, always layered, floors above floors, and even at the bottom there were floors within floors, and a person could be lifted a little, or borne a little higher, without ever once stepping fully into the sun of the free. And the road itself. Let us stand on it one last time. We have crossed it, you and I, on foot, at the lowest place. But there is a witness we should let speak, because he saw it with his own eyes, and his name has followed us quietly through all of this. Ibn Battuta. The traveller, the man from far away who came down into this world in the middle of the 14th century and wrote what he found. When he crossed the great desert, he did not cross it alone, and he did not cross it empty. He travelled with a caravan, and that caravan carried people. Captives, enslaved women among them, moving north the way the salt moved south, the way the gold moved north, as part of the same slow river of trade that made the whole thing run. Sit with the weight of that for a moment, in the quiet. The very same pages that tell us how safe the roads were, how a person could walk 2,000 kilometers and fear no thief, those pages are written by a man who is himself moving human beings across the sand as he writes, the comfort and the cruelty in one caravan. The order and the rope in the same line of camels. This is not a flaw in the story. This is the story. This is what it meant for the empire to be as rich and as ordered as it was. The safety on the road and the captives on the road were not two different worlds. They were the same world, seen from two different heights. And the desert did not care which height you rode at. For the merchant on his camel, the crossing was weeks of thirst and fear, water measured out between the wells, a guide reading the stars and the shape of the dunes, and the memory in his own head, the constant knowledge that to lose the path was to lose your life. That was the crossing for the man who had chosen to come. Now take everything hard about that, everything frightening, and take away the camel. Take away the choice, take away the water that was yours by right, and leave only what was given. Put your feet on the ground, and someone else's will over your steps. That was the crossing at the bottom. Same sand, same cold, same enormous, indifferent, dark, full of stars. Endured, though, without a single thing to soften it. The traveller feared the desert. The captive was handed to it. I told you, back at the start, that we would leave a question open. And we will. Where does that road end? For the one walking it in ropes, where does the desert finally let go? We have not answered it, and I am not going to answer it now, in the dark, at the edge of sleep. Some of that road ends at a place made of salt itself, worked by people in bondage in a settlement, with nothing good about it but the money to be made there. Some of it ends farther still, past the desert's northern lip, in markets we have only heard named. Let it stay open. Let the caravan walk on into the black, without us, the way it always did, whether we watched or not. And above all of it, above the road, above the field, above the flaws within flaws of that single hard word, sat the shape we called the empire. Mali, Mandan, the order set down. In the telling, after Sunjata Keita and the day at Kirina, when the world of the Mande was arranged into its long-standing three, the free-born, the set-apart makers and singers, and the bound. That order held the whole thing together like the frame of a house holds the floors. And laid across the frame, like light through a window, was faith, but faith of two kinds, in two places, not quite the same. In the court, in the towns, along the trade roads where the merchants moved, there was Islam. Prayer, kept faithfully. The Quran learned by heart. Ibn Battuta, who found so much to disapprove of in this land, could not withhold his admiration for that. For how carefully the people prayed, how they set their children to memorize the holy book, how seriously the practice was kept in the places he watched. That devotion impressed the outsider, and he said so plainly. But ride out from the court, out past the towns, into the villages along the river and the fields under the single rain, and the faith wore a different face. Older ways were still there, braided into the new. The court prayed one way, the countryside kept its own practice woven through, neither one fully swallowing the other. And the same traveller who admired the prayer was scandalized by the customs he could not fit into the world he knew. The freedom of the women in public, the foods, the rituals of the court, all of it strange and improper to his eyes. Remember, always, that his shock is a mirror held up to him, not to them. What offended him tells you about his home, his rules, the world he carried in his own head across the sand. It does not tell you that anything was wrong with the world he was looking at. It only tells you he was a stranger, seeing a place that did not answer to his measure. So that is the frame we climb inside now. Bound at the bottom, free in the great middle, faith at the court and faith in the fields, layered one over the other. Neither erasing the other, exactly as I said. Hold all of it loosely in the dark. Let the desert cool. Let the stranger's caravan disappear. Now come up a single rung. Not far, not yet, but enough to feel the difference in your feet. You are no longer roped, no one is walking behind you, the desert is not where you live, and the caravan that crossed it has nothing to do with your days. You are Horon, free-born. That word carries its full weight here, because the weight is real. There are people beneath you on this ladder who cannot say the same. But what freedom means in this place and in this century is not a modern freedom. It is not absence of obligation. It is not independence in the clean sense we might reach for. Your freedom is a defined thing, shaped and bounded, and it comes with a set of debts that you will pay all your life without anyone calling them debt. You will call them belonging, because that is what they are. You belong to a lineage. The lineage belongs to a place. The place belongs to the empire. All of that flows upward. You are simply the one who makes it flow. So, your life. Let us begin it at the place it always begins, the rain. You watch for it the way some people watch for a person they love and fear in equal measure. The rains come once. That is all. One long wet season, roughly June through September, 4 months if you are lucky, 3.5 if the sky makes you wait, and the timing shifts year to year in ways that keep the farmer permanently alert, permanently uncertain. There is no second chance. Miss the first real rains, plant too late, and the grain will not ripen before the dry comes back and takes it. Catch them too early, on a false start that dries up in a week, and you have wasted seed and broken ground on a promise the clouds didn't mean. So you watch. The colour of the sky in the late afternoon, the quality of the heat, whether the birds are doing something particular, whether your father and his father's memory, passed down in the things they said without thinking, tells you this moment or that moment is the one. You read the land the way a person reads a face, not by any single sign, but by everything at once. A reading that takes years to learn and can still be wrong. And when the sky opens, when the real, deep rains come down, and the ground turns from its dry, powdery pale to a dark, saturated red that holds the water, you go. The hoe in your hand is called the dabba. It is iron, short-handled, and you swing it with your body, your back and your hips doing the work, bent forward into the earth through the whole of the planting season. This is not a metaphor. This is your day. This is what you do while the rain falls and the ground stays workable and the clock of the single wet season runs. You and the people in your compound, your brothers, your father still if he lives, the women with their own tools in the women's portions of the field, the children old enough to carry and clear, you move through the earth in a pattern the lineage has always used. Because that pattern works on this particular land, in this particular light, and has been proven on it over generations. What you plant depends on where you are. And the land of the Mali Empire runs across a great belt of the West African continent, savanna and Sahel, river valley and open plain, each with its own rules. In the drier, harder zones, sorghum, that grain is remarkable. Genuinely remarkable, in the way that anything is remarkable which has been bred over centuries to survive what would kill other things. Sorghum sits in heat that would bleach another crop to straw. It stores water in its stalks. It waits. You plant it, and you do not entirely trust it until you see it push upward and stay. And even then you are watching the sky. Pearl millet is the same order of patience, a grain that can manage on rainfall that would break a wheat field, and that has been grown in this part of the world for so long that it has become itself a kind of knowledge stored in the seed. But where the water is better, the crops open up. African rice, not the Asian rice that came from across the ocean in centuries still ahead, but the rice native to this continent, Oryza glaberrima, cultivated in the inland Niger delta for longer than anyone has been writing it down, grows in the flooded plains where the Niger spills itself each year across an enormous shallow basin. An inland sea that appears on schedule and then retreats and leaves behind it soil so rich with silt and water that rice will take hold and grow without argument. Oryza glaberrima. That name, those words, belong to this crop the way the dabba belongs to your hand. It is not a background fact, it is the grain that the delta eats, that the delta has always eaten, that the inland sea makes possible and the river delivers. Fonio as well, small and fast-growing, a grain of difficult harvesting, the stalks shatter if you are rough, and the seeds scatter, and the window of gathering is narrow and unforgiving. But fonio fills a place nothing else fills, because it is ready before the larger grains. It is the in-between food, the bridge from one harvest to the next, eaten when the stores are low and the main crop hasn't come yet. And cowpeas, the legume that adds protein where the soil is thin and the grain diet needs balancing. Planted after the main crop in some places, cropped up in the spaces between rows, used as much by the soil as by the person. Its roots putting nitrogen back into the ground that sorghum and millet have taken out. All of this is what you grow, and none of it is purely yours. Not entirely. You owe a share upward, to the lineage head, to the local ruler, to the father claim of the provincial governor, and through him to the Mansa's reach. That share is not negotiated each year, it is simply owed, as rain is owed to the sky. You grew up knowing it the way you grew up knowing the dabba. And in a good year, when the rains came on time and the harvest was full, it felt like nothing, like setting down a portion of water from a full jar. In a bad year, when the rains were short, or the insects came, or the flood in the delta was too shallow or too deep, that same portion felt like something being taken that you needed. You gave it anyway. But most years are not the worst year. Hold that. Most years the grain comes in dry and golden, and you bring it to the granary, and the smell of it, dry and slightly sweet and dense, fills a particular corner of your sense memory that you will never fully name. The granary is raised on posts, the good ones, to keep it from the damp and the small animals. Inside the grain is life, it is the months ahead. It is what you can look at and know you will not starve, that the children will eat, that the next planting season will have seed to start from. There is a kind of calm that only comes from standing near a full granary. Not happiness exactly, not celebration. A quality of settling, like the land after a long rain, when everything is where it should be and nothing needs to be done about it right now. The year does not run on grain alone. This is the Niger's country, and the river gives. The Bozo people are the fishing people of these waters, and the Samono. Both of them keepers of a relationship with the Niger that goes back further than the empire, further than the memory that can be reliably followed. They know how to read the river's moods the way you read the sky for rain, by depth and colour and current and season, by where the fish gather and why, by what the water says when it rises and what it says when it falls. The Bozo cast nets from narrow wooden boats that move in silence along the brown water. They know the inland delta in its flooded season, when the whole central basin becomes a kind of shallow inland sea hundreds of kilometres across, and they know it in the dry season, when the channels narrow and the fish concentrate in the remaining water and become suddenly, briefly, easier to find. What they pull from the river comes to your markets, dried, smoked, salted, fish preserved for the long dry months, carrying protein across the time when the water is low and the nets are quiet. And the Fulani move through this land on the other side of the exchange. The Fulb, the herders, their cattle are the wealth that walks. Zebu cattle adapted to the heat, following the rains northward into the Sahel as the wet season pushes grass into the drier zones, and retreating southward again as the dry comes and the grass dies. The Fulani move with their herds in patterns that repeat year to year, not aimlessly, not randomly, but along routes that are known and claimed, and sometimes argued over. Routes that trace the edges of the farmers' fields and the river's margins and the open land that the savanna keeps. Milk in your diet, milk appears in the form of the sour fresh dairy that the herders trade at the village edge, a thin yogurt-like thing. Slightly sour, high in fat, filling in the way that grain is not quite filling. You might have it in the morning. You might have it after work. If you are lucky, if the Fulani came through in a good season and their cattle were fat and producing, you have it often. Your daily meal, the one that anchors everything, is too. A stiff paste, the consistency of something between thick porridge and bread, made from pounded millet or sorghum, the damp grain worked in a mortar until it coheres, then cooked into a dense mass that you tear pieces from with your fingers and dip into a sauce. The sauce is where the flavour lives. Baobab leaves, dried and powdered, give the sauce a slightly slimy body, a thickening, and a nutrition that the grain doesn't carry alone. Other leaves, other dried things, whatever the season allows. Fish if you are near the river. Cowpea leaves, shredded and wilted. Occasionally meat when an animal is slaughtered, a goat, a sheep, which happens at celebrations, at funerals. At the feasts the calendar demands, not daily. Meat is the exception that marks the day it happens. The two is the constant. You eat with your hands, around a shared bowl with the people of your compound. That shared bowl is not incidental. It is a statement about what you are. You eat with your people from the same food in the same place. The smallest children closest. The honoured elders given the best portion. The guest, if one has come, served first and given the fullest share. These are not manners in the thin, optional sense. They are a structure of obligation and belonging as real as any wall. And after the meal, in the long dry months when there is no field work, the evening comes down heavy and still and full of sound. Frogs, if there is water nearby, the creak of the wind in the silk cotton tree at the edge of the compound. Dogs somewhere, the fire going low. Children already asleep, the ones who fell first, and the adults sitting in the cooling dark talking about the things adults talked about. The rain, whose land borders whose, what a particular kinsman said at the market, what the next planting season might need. You are free. You are obligated. You are part of something larger than your own life, and mostly that is not a burden. Mostly that is simply what it means to exist in this place, in this time, in this particular arrangement of the world. The ladder runs above you. You do not think about it every day. You think about the rain. Now, next to you in this world, and set apart from you in ways the society makes very clear, are people who are something other than farmer, something other than fighter, something other than lord. They are the ones who work with their hands on the materials that transform, fire, iron, hide, word. They are the Nyamakala, and the word does not translate cleanly, because the category it names does not map onto anything we have a ready word for. Call them artisan castes for now, and understand that it is an incomplete translation. Step into the forge. You are not Horon now. You are something older, something that frightens people, a little even as they need you every day. You are the blacksmith. Numu. Your father was a Numu. His father before him was a Numu. His mother came from a Numu family, because Numu marry Numu, not as a rule handed down from a king's council, not as a law written somewhere, but as the natural order of things in this society, a boundary maintained over so many generations that it has become a fact about the world, rather than a decision anyone is consciously making. A smith marries a smith. A leatherworker marries a leatherworker. The lines stay separate because they are understood to be separate in a way that goes beyond trade or profession. The reason for this begins with niyama. Niyama is a concept you have to sit with because there is no English word for it and the translation always loses something. It is a vital force, an energy, a kind of occult power that moves through the world, through living things, through words when they are spoken, through the acts of killing, through the working of certain materials. It is not supernatural in the sense of being outside nature. It is nature's hidden current. Every creature has it. Trees have it. Words spoken aloud release it. And certain acts, killing an animal, working metal, speaking a name with full intention, disturb it, concentrate it, set it moving in ways that can be dangerous if you are not equipped to handle the surge. Nyama does not politely wait to be managed. It moves when it is disturbed, and it touches whoever is nearby. The smith is disturbed it constantly, every day. The fire, the hammer, the iron pulled from raw ore to finished tool, all of this is transformation, and transformation is exactly when Nyama surges. You take a thing from one state and force it into another. You are in the middle of that current all day in the dark interior of your forge, doing what would harm an ordinary person who had not been prepared, trained and born into the lineage that carries the knowledge of how to manage it. This is why the smith is respected. This is also why the smith is feared. The same hand that makes your hoe, that makes the arrowhead your son will carry into battle, that makes the iron ring marking a particular status, that same hand is in daily contact with a force most people prefer to avoid. You know things that other people do not know, and that knowing sets you apart as much as the heat and the soot, the forge itself. You know it better than you know any room in any house. Low-ceilinged, dark even in daylight, the walls thick with the accumulated soot of years. The bellows are made from goatskin, 2 of them, alternating. The apprentice working them with a rhythm that keeps the airflow constant into the base of the fire. You can hear the bellows from outside the forge. That alternating breath, that steady pulse, hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo. It carries into the compound, into the village, and people know by the sound that the forge is running, that the smith is working, that something is being made or remade. The sound itself is a kind of announcement. Something is happening in there. The iron glows in the fire, not yellow-white like a cooking fire. A deeper, more specific orange that shifts toward white at its center, and you read that color the way you read the rain sky, by a knowledge that lives in the eye, not in words. Too cool, and it won't move under the hammer. Too long, and you lose control. There is a window, and you work in it with a speed that looks casual and is not casual at all. The hammer comes down in strikes that have a direction, a sequence, a logic. The iron yields. It spreads and flattens and lengthens under the hammer's instruction, and the shape that was only in your head becomes a shape in the world, and then it goes back into the fire for the next pass, and the bellows breathe again, and the apprentice watches, because one day it will be his hands doing what your hands are doing. The dabba, the plough hoe that the free farmer uses to break the ground and plant with the first rain. You made that. Or your father made it, or the smith before him, but the shape has been refined over generations of making, because the dabba has to work with the particular soil of the Sahel, in the particular posture of a farmer working in heat, for the particular length of a planting day. It is not an arbitrary shape. Every curve in the blade is an argument about how iron meets earth, and the smith is the one who has settled that argument over and over until the answer became obvious. Spear points too. Arrow tips. The narrow, efficient things that the army carries, these come from your fire. The whole military and agricultural capacity of the empire rests, in the most literal physical sense, on the smith's fire. But the smith does more than iron. You are also the one who performs circumcision, the ritual that marks the transition of boys into the world of men. In many communities along the Niger, in many villages of the Mande world, it is the Numu who performs this. And the carving of masks, the objects used in the ceremonies that govern the invisible life of the community, the things that carry power and are treated with power, those too come from the smith's hands. Not because the smith is also an entertainer or a craftsman in the decorative sense, because the smith is already in the territory of Nyama. Who else would you trust with an object that is supposed to hold and direct spiritual power? You need someone who works in that territory, who understands it, who will not be destroyed by the encounter. The smith is already there. It is simply another kind of iron. The children in your compound grow up hearing the bellows. The boys who will inherit this trade begin at the edge, watching, carrying fuel, working the bellows when their arms are strong enough, learning the color of the fire before they ever touch a hammer. There is no certificate at the end. There is no graduation. There is only the accumulation of knowing, of having done it wrong enough times in supervised conditions to understand why the right way is the right way, until one day you do it right without having to think about it, and that is the moment the trade has passed into you. Your wife is also Numu, not by coincidence and not by law, but by the logic of this world. Her mother was Numu. Her mother's mother was Numu. She works in clay. Pottery is another of the trades that the Numu women carry, and her hands on clay are not entirely different from your hands on iron. Both of you are reaching into a material that other people prefer not to touch, shaping it through heat and intention, pulling it from one form into another. The Nyama moves for her too. The pots she makes hold the water the village drinks, carry the grain from the granary to the cooking fire, serve as the vessels at the centre of the household's daily life. She makes a thing that everyone needs, that everyone uses every day, and she makes it with a knowledge they do not have and cannot simply acquire by watching. You eat together at the end of the day in your compound, which is separate, not walled off, not exiled, but located at the edge of the village, in the way the forge is located at the edge, close enough to be reached, far enough to be set apart. You are not outcast. You are not enslaved. You are respected in a very particular way, the way you might respect a fire, with genuine gratitude for its warmth and real caution about getting too close. People need what you make. They bring you things to be fixed or forged or shaped. They pay you in grain, in cloth, in the goods of the household. But they do not entirely forget what you are. They do not entirely stop noticing the soot on your hands, the burned scars from metal that flew wrong, the particular look of someone who works near heat all day. You carry the forge with you. It is on your skin. And the children who grow up as your children carry it too. Born into this, from their first morning to their last, they are Numu. Not farmers, not warriors, not merchants, not griers. Numu, the artisan caste that works with fire and earth and the forces running underneath both. They will not become something else. They will become better at what they already are. Now move one step sideways. Not up or down the ladder exactly, but along a parallel rung. The garanki, the leatherworker. Another Nyamakala caste, another hereditary craft, another world of knowledge that outsiders do not carry and cannot easily enter. If the smith's material is iron, the garanki's material is skin, animal skin, transformed and useful, the byproduct of the killing that feeds the village, turned into the things that hold the village together. Hides are not automatically leather. That is the knowledge the garanki carries. A raw hide, fresh from a slaughtered animal, will dry stiff and brittle or rot in the wet season if it is not worked. The garanki knows how to soften it, scrape it, treat it with materials that stabilize it without stiffening it, work it until it is supple and strong and will hold a shape under use. The process is slow and smells the way anything involving animal matter smells when it is being transformed, not pleasant, in the way that the forge is not exactly pleasant either, a working smell. The smell of a substance being changed. You do not mind it. You have never known a time when it wasn't there. What you make from this material is everything that holds a life together. Saddles for the horses of the cavalry, and the Mali Empire, at its height, maintained a significant force of cavalry, horses being one of the northern trade goods that came south along the salt routes, expensive enough that only the military class and the wealthy could keep them. A saddle is not ornamental. A saddle is engineering. It distributes the rider's weight in a way that allows the horse to move without injury, that allows the rider to stay seated through hours of riding, that holds its shape under heat and sweat and the impact of a galloping horse over uneven ground. You make it from pieces of leather that you know by the feel of them, stitched with thread so consistent and tight that the seam will not fail mid-ride, stuffed and shaped and finished until it is a thing that will outlast its first owner. Sandals. Every person in this empire who wears something on their feet wears something the garanki made. Sandals shaped to the foot, with straps that do not cut, that flex in the heat, that survive the dust of the Sahara's edge and the mud of the savanna rainy season. A simple thing, a sandal, and also not simple at all, because the failure of a sandal on a long journey is the failure of the journey. Bags and sacks and the carrying vessels of daily life, sheaths for the blades the smith made, because a blade without a sheath is a danger to its carrier. And the two crafts are linked, smith and leatherworker, the iron and the cover of the iron working together. You make the sheaths, the smith makes what goes inside them. You will probably never work in the same room, but your products are never separated. And then the amulets. This is where your work touches the invisible in a way that people pay close attention to. The leather amulet case, a small envelope, carefully stitched, sometimes dyed, sometimes decorated with an elegance that has nothing to do with function and everything to do with the care you put into a thing that will be worn against the body. Inside the case, a strip of paper or cloth on which a verse from the Quran has been written by a scholar, folded or rolled to fit. The whole object, once sealed, is worn around the neck, the arm, the waist, carried against the skin, as protection, as a petition, as a connection to something larger and more powerful than the individual body wearing it. In French these are called gris-gris, though the word carries layers of meaning that shift depending on who is using it and when. What they are, in this world, is a joining of two kinds of knowledge: the Islamic scholarly tradition that provides the text, the Quran's language understood as carrying divine force, and the old Mande understanding of Nyama, of power in objects, of the physical world being penetrated by forces that can be gathered and directed. The amulet is where those two streams meet in a piece of leather small enough to hold in your palm. The garanki makes the vessel, the scholar provides the text, the person wearing it provides the need. You make them carefully. Not reverently exactly. The making is work, and work has its rhythms and its efficiency, but with attention, because the care of the making is part of what the object is. A badly stitched amulet case, one that might split and lose what is inside it, is a failed amulet. You make them so they will hold. The horse trappings, too, the straps and bridles and decorative pieces that go on the cavalry horse of a wealthy man or a provincial lord. These are where the garanki's work becomes most visible, most public. A horse that is well appointed with good leather strapping, that moves through the market or the processional route with its equipment whole and properly fitted, is a statement about its owner and incidentally about the person whose craft adorns it. Your work rides through the capital on horseback. It appears at court on the bodies of the officials. It is everywhere, and your name is on none of it, because a craftsperson's name does not travel with the object the way a lord's name travels with his land. But the knowledge does, quietly, in the way craft knowledge always travels, by the evidence of itself, by the thing working the way it should work, by the saddle that doesn't fail, and the amulet that doesn't split. Your wife is garanki. That is not a sentence that needs explaining inside this world, because inside this world it explains itself. She does not have a choice that was made out loud one day and weighed against other options. She was born into a garanki lineage, and so was her husband, and the children they have will be garanki, and their children after that. This is the shape of the Nyamakala. Endogamous. The word means the group marries within itself. Not within the immediate family, the incest rules are as real here as anywhere, but within the caste. A garanki looks for a spouse among the other garanki families, and they are not hard to find because they are located at a level of the social order that has been maintained for generations, and everyone knows where it is. Why? You might ask that question from outside, from a later vantage where the category feels like a restriction. Inside, the question almost inverts. The craft is the inheritance. The knowledge of leather, what to do with it, how to treat it, what it can become. That knowledge is held in the family, accumulated in the family, refined in the family over time. A child born into a garanki family begins learning from before they can articulate what they are learning. The smell of treated hide is the smell of home. The sound of work, the scraping, the stitching, the careful stretching, is the ambient sound of childhood. By the time that child is old enough to be formally taught, they are already half-taught. The knowledge is in the hands before it is in the head. To marry outside the caste would be to introduce someone into that inheritance who does not carry it in their body, who has to learn it from the beginning rather than from the cradle, who might not value it in the way that a person who has grown up inside it values it, and their children, who would be half garanki in lineage, would inherit a divided inheritance, half the knowledge, half the claim, half the belonging. The caste endogamy is not primarily about restriction, though it is also that. It is about the transmission of knowledge across generations. It is a technology for keeping expertise intact. The Numu marry Numu for the same reason, and the answer is the same. A smith's child who grows up hearing the bellows will know the fire before they ever stand at it. A smith who marries someone from outside the smithing lineage is bringing in someone who has to start at the beginning, whose children will have to start at the beginning. whose hands will not carry the specific knowing that makes the difference between a blade that holds and a blade that fails. The knowledge is the inheritance. The marriage is how the inheritance is protected. There is also, underneath this, the matter of nyama again. The numu handle forces that other people do not handle, and they have a capacity, built through the lineage and through practice, to manage those forces without being damaged by them. Their children inherit some portion of that capacity. It is understood, not automatically, not completely, but as a starting point that has to be developed. A child from outside the lineage does not start there. They start without it. And the force does not wait while you catch up. So the caste is set apart not merely by what it does, but by what it is believed to be, a lineage that has, over time, built a particular relationship with the forces at work in the world's hidden layer. That relationship is real to everyone in this world, as real as rain and iron. And the endogamy is how you keep it from dispersing. You do not let it thin out across 100 different lineages, mixed and diluted until the capacity is gone. You hold it in the group. You pass it whole, or as close to whole as inheritance ever is. In the evenings, when the forge has gone cold and the leather work is rolled and stored, when the compound comes to its quiet, you sit where you always sit, at the edge of things. The farmers are in the centre, where they have always been. The traders come and go, moving through on their way to somewhere more important. The lords are up the slope, behind the nicer walls. You are where you are, necessary, respected, feared in that particular sidelong way, and entirely at home in the night air that carries the particular smell of your trade, which has been your smell as long as you can remember, which is not a smell you would change for anything, because it is the smell of the knowledge that is yours and your children's, which no one can take, which has kept your family alive and useful and set apart, in the best sense of that word, for as long as the empire has stood. The night deepens. The compound settles. Somewhere in the village, one fire is still lit. The iron tools are stacked against the wall of the forge, waiting for morning. The saddle that isn't finished yet is folded in the workroom, waiting for the next pass. Nothing is complete. Work is never complete. There is always the next tool, the next amulet, the next blade, the next repair, the next commission from the Lord who wants new trappings for his horse before the next journey. The list does not end. But the day does. And the day ending is enough. Let that settle. Let the forge go dark in your mind. Let the dabba lean against the granary wall and the smell of the two drift from the cooking fire into the cool air over the compound. The farmers and the smiths and the leather workers are all under the same stars tonight, all across the great savanna where the single rain fell and the single harvest came and the sorghum is stored and the iron is cooling and the leather is rolled and the night is long and quiet and without hurry. The Niger moves in the dark, wide and steady, carrying the inland delta toward its great spreading fan of water, where the bozo nets are drawn in and the fish dry on their frames, and the cattle of the Fulani are settled for the night somewhere out on the edge of the plain. All of this is here. All of this is real. The ladder runs on above it, and we will climb, but not yet. The ladder runs on above it, and we will climb now. But the next rung is not what you might expect. It belongs to someone who carries no iron, works no hide, and breaks no ground. The hands are softer, the back is not bent over a hoe. And yet this person is, in a way that takes a moment to really feel, perhaps the most essential figure in the whole structure. Not because of what he makes or grows, but because of what he holds. Because this empire, like every great pre-literate civilization, runs on memory. And the memory lives in a person. The word is djeli. You may have heard the French word griot used for the same role, a foreign label borrowed later by outsiders to describe something that had its own name long before any European wrote it down. Djeli, and the djeli is not, as it might first sound, simply an entertainer, not a court musician hired to make the feasts more pleasant. The djeli is the living record of a people, the genealogist who holds every bloodline in his head, the historian who carries the wars and the treaties and the alliances of 2 centuries without a single page of text, the diplomat who moves between powerful men and says the things they cannot say to each other directly, the praise singer who elevates, and the truth speaker who can name what others dare not name. All of that, in one person. In one lineage, passed from parent to child, generation to generation, each child trained almost from birth to receive what the parent carries, to add to it, and to carry it forward intact. The djeli is nyamakala, the same broadcast order as the blacksmith and the leather worker, those endogamous hereditary specialists who marry within their group and pass their work downward through blood. And like the smith, the djeli is both respected and held at a careful distance, respected and quietly feared, essential and slightly uncanny, because the djeli handles nyama in its most concentrated form, the nyama of words. You have to slow down here and sit with that. Nyama, that occult vital energy running through all things, through iron and fire and the act of transformation, also lives in language. Words are not neutral. In Mande thought, as it comes down to us through centuries of practice, a word spoken aloud carries force. It can bless or harm. It can raise up or bring down. The power of praise in this world is not metaphorical, not a polite compliment one person offers another. It is a transference of energy. It is a real thing, moving in the air. And the person who handles that energy, who wields it daily, who directs it at kings and warriors and lineages, that person must be equipped for it, must be trained for it, must carry the capacity to manage what ordinary people cannot touch safely. This is why the djeli speaks where the king falls silent. We will come back to that. It is one of the more quietly astonishing things Ibn Battuta, that eyewitness traveller from Tangier who visited the Mali court around 1352 under Mansa Suleiman, recorded about the empire's ceremonies. But first, let the djeli's daily life settle around you. Imagine growing up in a djeli household. Your father is already old in this work, his memory vast, his repertoire of genealogies and praise names and historical narratives accumulated over 40 years of performance and study. Before you can read, there is no reading expected of you for this work, no book to consult. You begin to learn. Your father recites, and you repeat. Long passages of the praise poem for a particular noble family. The sequence of ancestors going back 7 generations. The correct order of events in a battle that happened 100 years before you were born. You repeat them until the words are no longer words, but something more like muscle. Something that lives in the body and not only in the mind. Something you could be woken from sleep to perform and still have come out right. The instruments are part of it. The kora is perhaps the most immediately recognizable, a harp lute strung with 21 strings across a gourd body covered in cowhide, played with the thumbs and the index fingers while the other fingers brace the neck, producing a sound that cascades, that flows, that sounds. If you have heard it, like water over stones, but with each individual drop perfectly deliberate. The ngoni is older and simpler, a lute with a skin-covered body and a few strings, a plucked instrument that gives a lower, earthier note closer to the ground. And then there is the bala, the balafon, a wooden xylophone that is the closest translation, though it undersells it, with gourd resonators hanging beneath each wooden key, so that when the player strikes a key with a padded mallet, the sound blooms outward and hums inside the gourd beneath it, giving it a resonance that is almost alive, as if the instrument is breathing. The bala is ancient, in the tradition of the Manda people, and here we are, in the territory of legend, of what is called T3 knowledge. Not a written historical record, but an oral one, culturally authoritative and spiritually central, even if it cannot be verified the way a dated document can. The most sacred balafon in the world is the Soso Bala. The tradition holds that it belonged to Sumanguru Kant, the sorcerer king of the Soso people, the man who dominated the region before Sunjata Keita rose to challenge him. Sumanguru is remembered in the epic tradition not only as a political ruler, but as a figure of immense and frightening occult power, a man who wore an iron tower and spoke to spirits, and whose nyama was terrible. When Sunjata defeated him at the Battle of Kirina, around 1235 by the calendar, the tradition says the balafon was taken as a prize of war, a captured talisman, the instrument of a conquered power now belonging to the victors. It is still kept, according to tradition, in Guinea. UNESCO has recognized the Soso Bala and the ceremonies around it as part of intangible world heritage. Whether the instrument itself is the original, whether Sumanguru held it exactly as the epic says, that is a question for scholars to sit with carefully. What is not in question is that the tradition exists, has been maintained for centuries, and carries an enormous weight of meaning for the people who hold it. The Bala captured from a sorcerer king. Held now. Still played. The djeli lineage most associated with the Keita rulers, the ruling family that produced Sunjata and all the Mansas of Mali, is the Kuyat line. The tradition traces the Kuyat griots back to Bala Fask, Sunjata's own djeli, the griot who accompanied the young king in exile, who encouraged him when he was low, who proclaimed his deeds when he rose, and who kept his story so that it could be passed down. A griot without a king has no stage, a king without a griot has no memory. The relationship is not employer and employee, but something closer to symbiosis. Each requires the other to exist in the way they must exist. Now imagine the moment of a public ceremony, a gathering in the capital, nobles assembled, the family of a great man celebrating a marriage or a return from war or a funeral. The djeli steps into the center of this space. He begins on the ngoni, the notes low and preparatory, a kind of clearing of the air. And then he begins to speak, not quite sing, somewhere in the space between, a rhythmic chant over the notes, a cascade of names. Your father's 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 father, the deeds of each one, the battles won, the alliances made, the generosities performed and remembered, each name a small charge of nyama directed at the assembled family, a restoration of their dignity and standing in the ears of everyone present. And the family responds. Gifts move toward the djeli, cloth, gold dust, food. Because this is how it works, the djeli gives the gift of memory and public elevation, and the gift flows back in material form. The economy of words and goods. But the djeli does not only praise. There is a harder function buried in the role, one that is less often talked about, but just as real. A king cannot easily hear difficult truths from a member of the horon, the free-born noble class, because the social order makes such directness dangerous for the speaker and uncomfortable for the receiver. But a djeli can say what others cannot, can name a failure, can, through the frame of story and praise, deliver a criticism that a direct speaker would lose his head for. The djeli exists partly as the empire's mechanism for speaking truth to power without the blood cost that usually comes with it. A safety valve built into the social structure, a role for necessary speech. And this, finally, is why the Mansa would not speak with his own mouth. Ibn Battuta, that careful and opinionated traveller, sat in the court of Mansa Suleiman in the mid-14th century and watched something that genuinely puzzled him. The Mansa sat in his great domed pavilion, a detail we will return to at the top of the ladder, and when the Mansa wished to communicate, he did not address the assembled court himself. He leaned slightly toward a spokesman, a herald, who then relayed the king's words outward to the gathered audience, and when the audience needed to speak to the king, the same herald received the words and carried them to the Mansa. Ibn Battuta called this figure a djeli, and the function, whatever its precise ceremonial logic in any given moment, makes sense within everything the culture believed about nyama and words. The king's words carry an enormous charge. A king's speech directed without mediation at a subject is almost too much. It requires a handler, a specialist trained in exactly this kind of power, to carry it safely from the source to the receiver. The djeli as lightning rod, as the person equipped to touch what would burn another. There is something very quiet in that image, if you let yourself rest in it. A great king in a pavilion, robed and canopied and surrounded by every symbol of authority, who nevertheless will not speak directly, who depends on one man whose title is not general or governor or tax collector, but memory keeper, praise singer, word handler, to carry the weight of his voice into the world. Power and words held apart, the space between them managed by a person trained for nothing else. The night is still. Let that image rest there. Now the scene shifts. Still the empire, still the same world, but a different life entirely, lived mostly outdoors, mostly in motion, the ground beneath your feet not red savanna earth, but the pale, nearly colourless sand and stone of the Sahara. And the sky above, not the humid close sky of the rainy season, but the immense tilted blue sky of the desert that goes on so high above you it almost hurts to look at. You are a merchant, a caravan merchant on the salt gold routes, and your life is in many ways the opposite of the djelis, not rooted in a court, not bound to a family and its memory, not stationary. Your life is the road, more precisely, the absence of road. Because what you cross has no roads. It has tracks, sometimes marked wells, routes that exist in the knowledge of the guides who know them, but not roads. The Sahara does not do roads. The dromedary camel is what makes your life possible. Just that one fact. The single-humped dromedary, not the two-humped Bactrian of Central Asia, but the one-humped animal bred for exactly this world, is a creature so precisely adapted to the desert that it seems sometimes like the desert made it on purpose. The hump is not, as is often thought, a storage tank of water. It is stored fat, a reserve of energy that lets the animal go days without grazing. The camel's body handles water loss with unusual efficiency, able to go without drinking for stretches that would kill a horse in hours. Its wide, padded feet do not sink into soft sand the way a hoofed animal's narrow feet would. Its nostrils can close against a sandstorm. Its long lashes protect eyes that have seen 1,000 crossings. None of this is magic. It is biology accumulated over millennia. But from where you stand, leading a string of these animals across the Sahara, it might as well be. A camel can carry roughly 300 kilograms of goods, about the weight of 3 or 4 grown men, across the desert in a day's march. Multiply that across a caravan of hundreds of animals, and you have a floating warehouse crossing one of the most hostile environments on Earth. This is what ties the gold, producing south to the salt-hungry, north and back again. Not roads. Camels. Your own goods are loaded before dawn. The night before, the bundles were checked, relashed, the weights distributed evenly across each animal's back so neither side pulls harder. Salt slabs going south, cloth and copper beads and glass from the north going south too, until the distribution point, and then you will return with gold dust and ivory and whatever else the southern markets can provide. The loading takes hours. The camels complain. They always complain, loud, protesting, gargling sounds that fill the pre-dawn darkness. You have long since stopped hearing it as anything remarkable. The caravan moves with the darkness as long as it can. The desert is coldest before dawn, not pleasantly cool, not the coolness of an autumn morning, but something that gets into the joints and makes the fingers slow. Bitter cold that feels improbable in a place that will be killing hot by midday. You pull the cloth around you and walk. The caravan walks. The camel's feet on the sand are almost soundless, a soft compression, again and again, in a rhythm you have long since internalized. The stars overhead are extraordinary. Out here, away from any settlement, no fire or lamp to dim them. They are a ceiling of actual light, so dense in some stretches that the darkness between them seems almost incidental. Your guide, a Tuareg man, or Berber, part of a people who have navigated this desert for centuries and know it the way a farmer knows his fields, moves by those stars and by other things you cannot entirely read yourself. The shape of particular dunes, the way the wind moves across the surface of the sand. Accumulated knowledge that took a lifetime to build, a lifetime that took place almost entirely in this landscape. The route from the southern termini, the entrept towns at the edge of the Sahel, where goods transfer from the savanna world to the desert world, to the northern cities on the other side of the Sahara, takes weeks. Ibn Battuta, who made this crossing himself and wrote about it with the precision of a man who genuinely feared he might not survive, describes being terrified. Not immediately, not on the first day when the town is still visible behind you and the desert feels merely large. Later, when the days have accumulated and the sameness of the landscape becomes a kind of pressure, and the wells that the route depends on must be found, and if a well is dry or poisoned, the calculation shifts from trade to survival. The takshif. Ibn Battuta uses this word for the guide who is sent ahead of the main caravan, who goes in front to reach the next watering point and send word back, so the caravan can move toward a known destination rather than into uncertainty. Sending a person ahead into the desert, on foot or on a faster animal, trusting him to find water and send back notice. The whole caravan's life suspended on this one man moving alone through the sand. Think about what that trust requires. Think about what the takshif's job requires of him. He is the advanced scout of survival. The desert kills the careless. Heat in the middle of the day that can kill within hours without shade or water. Cold at night that can kill without covering. Sandstorms that move faster than a man can run, that reduce visibility to nothing, that can bury a well in hours. Wind that strips moisture from the body so efficiently that thirst comes before you expect it. Ibn Battuta writes of travellers who fell behind, who wandered from the route, who were not found. He writes of skeletons at the side of paths. The Sahara does not particularly care about your commercial intentions. The salt going south and the gold going north mean nothing to the sand. And yet, the routes were travelled again and again, generation upon generation, because the incentive at both ends was enormous enough to justify the risk. Because gold from the southern forests and fields was worth almost nothing in a place where everyone had gold and nothing to preserve food with. And salt from the Saharan mines was worth almost nothing at its source, and worth everything in the savanna south. The trade existed because each side had what the other desperately needed. That is the mechanism. The risk of the desert was the price of admission to the opportunity that gap created. You travel through Walata, Owalata, the town at the southern edge of the desert, a collection of mud brick buildings the colour of the earth itself, so that from a distance the town barely distinguishes itself from the ground it sits on. This is where the desert ends and the savanna begins. Or rather, it is the transitional zone between them, that strip of semi-arid land called the Sahel, the Arabic word for shore, as if the Sahara were an ocean and the Sahel its coastline, which is not a bad way to think of it. Walata receives caravans and distributes goods. Its merchants know what the northern traders are carrying and what the southern buyers want. The information is as valuable as the goods themselves. Later, as the empire expands and trade intensifies, Timbuktu, further east, on the Niger's Great Bend, becomes the more famous Intrept. But in the period we are moving through, Walata is where the Saharan routes discharge, and Timbuktu grows from a seasonal camp into a permanent town and eventually into something more. A city of commerce and increasingly of scholarship, where the call to prayer rings from minarets over mud-brick streets, and where, in the schools and mosques, thousands of manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, law, theology, and medicine are being collected and copied. Timbuktu, as the world later pictures it, remote, golden, beyond reaching, is actually a functioning intellectual city in a functioning empire connected by these same routes to Cairo and Morocco and beyond. The knowledge moves with the gold. But before Timbuktu, before the manuscripts and the mosques, there is Taghaza, and Taghaza is where the salt comes from. Taghaza is not a city in any sense that invites romance. It sits in the deep Sahara, in a place where almost nothing lives that doesn't have to. No trees, no rivers, no shade that isn't made by walls. Ibn Battuta passed through Taghaza on his crossing and described it with a kind of economical horror. The buildings of the settlement and even the mosque were built of blocks of salt. The floors were salt. The ceilings were supported on salt pillars. When it rained, when it rained, the buildings dissolved slightly and had to be repaired. The settlement existed for one reason only. The earth there was thick with rock salt. Great slabs of it crystallized over geological time, and someone had to cut it out of the ground and send it south. That someone was enslaved. The Masufa people, a Berber group, held the Taghaza trade, and the labour of cutting and loading the salt slabs was performed by enslaved workers. Ibn Battuta noted that the salt workers' only food was camel flesh and dates and millet imported from the south, because Taghaza produced nothing edible, no grain, no fruit, nothing that grew. Everything consumed there came from somewhere else, carried in by the same caravans that carried the salt out. To live at Taghaza was to live in total dependence on the trade you served. The only reason to stay was because you had no choice, or because the profit was, for the free participants, worth the misery. Ibn Battuta, who was not a sentimental man and who saw a great deal of the world, wrote that there was nothing good about Taghaza except the money. The salt slabs themselves are cut in standard ish sizes, slabs of rock salt, dense and pale and heavy, loaded onto camels and carried south in their original form. Not processed, not refined, just cut from the ground and transported. The salt in these slabs is real salt, sodium chloride, the same mineral your body needs to maintain its fluids and send signals along its nerves and contract its muscles. Every animal on Earth that eats plants instead of meat has to find salt somewhere, because plants don't contain it in the quantities a body requires. And in the hot, sweating, labour-intensive life of the West African savanna, where the rains come hard for a few months and then stop, where the farmers hoe and plant and weed through the heat, where the Fulani herders walk with their cattle for miles every day, salt loss is constant. The body demands replacement. Now consider, the savanna where the Mande farmers live has almost no salt. The rock under the soil is not salt-bearing. The rivers carry very little of it. To get salt, you must either trade for it or go without it, and going without it, in the long run, means weakness and sickness and eventually death. Salt is not a luxury item in this world. It is not a condiment. It is a survival requirement. And it is almost entirely absent from the place where the most people live. North across the desert, at Taghaza and other mines. Salt sits in the ground in slabs of almost pure mineral, cut by enslaved hands, loaded on camels, and carried south across a crossing that takes weeks and kills the careless. Every kilometre it travels south, its value climbs. In Walata, it is worth something. In the market towns of the upper Niger, it is worth more. Pushed into the interior, further from the caravan routes, into the salt-poor heart of the savanna, it approaches a value that seems from the outside almost impossible. The sources say, and here we are in the realm of what is directionally true rather than precisely measured, that in the far southern markets, at the edge of the gold-producing forests, salt and gold traded near ounce for ounce. That a slab of rock salt carried over the desert and south through the savanna was worth its weight in the gold that the same region produced. Al-Umari and others recorded versions of this, as did the geographic traditions that accumulated around the trans-Saharan trade over centuries. The exact ratio, ounce for ounce, pound for pound, is almost certainly a rhetorical formulation, a way of conveying something true in vivid form. The audited exchange rate, the precise weighing out in a specific market on a specific day, is not something we have recorded. But the underlying economic reality is real. Salt, in the salt-starved South, was so scarce and so necessary that it commanded a price that seems shocking only if you have never lived in a world where it was hard to find. In a world where it was hard to find, it was worth everything. And there, in that single trading moment, those two substances balanced on a scale, one cut from the desert floor and the other panned from a river or chipped from a seam in the earth, the whole logic of the empire's economy becomes visible. The empire did not produce both of these things in the same place. No single location had salt and gold together. The salt was far north in the Sahara, at Taghaza and other sites. The gold was far south, in the forests and rivers of Bambouk and Bure and other fields, the empire half controlled and half left alone. The distance between them, measured in weeks of desert crossing and savanna walking, was enormous, and the empire sat in the middle, controlling the routes, taxing the trade at both ends, taking its share of the salt coming south and the gold going north. This is what a caravan merchant's life is built on: the arbitrage of geography, the profit that exists between where a thing is almost worthless and where that same thing is almost priceless. You carry the thing across the distance. The distance is the source of your income. The danger of the distance is the price you pay. So your life is danger and reward in roughly equal measure. The weeks crossing the Sahara, the cold nights and the scolding days, the knowledge that a sandstorm or a dry well or a wrong turning could end everything. And on the other side of all that, the market at Walata, the unloading of salt slabs, the trade for gold dust, weighed out in small measures on accurate scales, the loading of the return goods, the slow reckoning of what you paid and what you received, and whether the margin covered the risk and the loss. A camel died in the crossing. 2 bolts of cloth were damaged by sand. A measure of copper beads found no buyer at the price you wanted. You adjust. You always adjust. The calculation runs continuously in the background of every other thought. At Walata, Ibn Battuta records being displeased with his lodging, a small detail, but vivid. He had travelled this enormous distance, and the accommodation was, in his view, inadequate. A scholar and judge from Tangier, accustomed to the hospitality of a certain standard, deposited in a mud-brick room at the edge of the Sahara and dissatisfied. The merchants who travelled this route regularly would have found his reaction perhaps slightly amusing. You take the lodging you are given. The route itself is the achievement. The room is a minor thing. The entrept towns have a rhythm of their own. Walata and later Timbuktu are not Mali's great farming towns. They don't sit at the heart of the agricultural economy. They are transfer points, nodes in a network. At any given time, a mix of peoples might be present: North African merchants who have come down from the other side, Tuareg and Berber caravan guides and traders, Mande merchants from the empire's interior, scholars and legal experts and Quranic teachers in the mosques. The call to prayer echoes from a minaret over walls the colour of sand. In the evenings, the merchants sit together and exchange news, not personal news, or not only that, but market news. What is the price of salt in this town versus the last? What goods are scarce in the next settlement south? Whether the road west has been safe or troubled. Information is a good like any other. It has value. It moves. Timbuktu, at its height within and after the Mali Empire's reign, becomes something else entirely on top of this commerce, a place of Islamic scholarship of genuine international significance, with thousands of students in its schools and mosques, manuscripts copied and stored and discussed in numbers that surprised European historians when they began to understand what was there. The Sankor Mosque and the Jingariba Mosque, the latter connected in tradition to Mansa Musa's pilgrimage and the architect he brought back from Mecca, a man named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili from Andalusia, who is credited in the sources with royal building works, though the details are T2, passed through later records rather than contemporaneous ones, are centres of learning in a tradition of Islamic scholarship that places Timbuktu not at the edge of the world, but at a crossroads of it. The image of Timbuktu as unreachably remote is, essentially, backwards. It was remote only to the people who didn't know how to cross the Sahara. For the people who did know, it was a city. And you, as a caravan merchant, know the Sahara. You have crossed it before and will cross it again, assuming the well at the next marker is not dry and the guide is as reliable as his reputation, and the camels hold up through the hardest stretch and the sandstorm that was building on the western horizon when you made camp last night either disperses or passes north of your route. You calculate these things not with fear, but with the practiced assessment of a person who has learned to read the desert the way the djeli reads a lineage. Pattern recognition. Accumulated experience. The knowledge that is the difference between arriving in Walata with a full inventory and not arriving at all. The salt is loaded. The route is known. The stars tonight are clear and cold, and the guide is confident about tomorrow's march. The camels have watered at the well and are as settled as camels ever get, which is a relative thing, a spectrum of complaint from loud to merely audible. Your shelter for this night is the open sky, the ground wrapped in cloth, the desert cold doing what it always does. Far to the south, in a place you have not been and will not go, beyond the range of the caravan routes, deeper into forest and river country than the merchants generally venture, someone else is at work. Someone whose existence makes your cargo valuable and whose identity is, deliberately and carefully, unknown to you. The gold miners, the people at the source of it all. And here the empire runs into something it cannot solve. The goldfields of Bambouk and Buri lay far to the south of the caravan routes, in river country where the dry Sahel gave way to something greener and older and more secretive. The upper reaches of the Senegal, the upper reaches of the Niger's tributaries, these were the veins in the rock that the whole empire ultimately ran on. Not the king's pavilion, not the governor's tribute counts, not the merchant's careful ledgers. The gold came from here, from the ground, from people who had made a deliberate and successful choice to remain invisible. No one in the dossier of merchants who travelled through Mali gives you a name from those goldfields. No one gives you a face. The Arabic geographers who wrote about the empire and its wealth, al-Umari recording what Cairo remembered of Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, the earlier writers like al-Masudi and Yakut, working from travellers' reports, describe the gold-bearing peoples of the Deep South in the same way, as a presence known by its products and unknown by almost everything else. They emerged. They left gold. They retreated. Their mines were somewhere in the forest and the laterite hills, and the location of those mines was a secret kept with enough care that it survived centuries of interest from the richest and most powerful men of the age. Think about what that means, and settle into the thinking slowly. The Empire of Mali was, at its height, a state that could field an army, tax two of the most valuable trade commodities in the known world, and move a caravan of such size across North Africa that it depressed the economies of the cities it visited. It was not an entity lacking in organizational capacity or military reach. And yet the goldfields were held at a distance, traded with rather than ruled, because someone had worked out, through experience, or through the failure of the alternative, that the gold only kept coming as long as no king reached in and tried to take direct control. Al-Umari wrote this down because Mansa Musa himself apparently said it. The account comes to us second-hand, filtered through the memory of Cairo's scholars and officials writing about the pilgrimage roughly 12 years after it happened. So you hold it with appropriate care. But the logic it describes is convincing. When the empire tried to extend its rule southward into the gold-producing country, production fell. The miners withdrew, or withheld, or simply stopped working in the way that made the arrangement valuable. And so the empire stopped trying. It accepted the bargain, leave the miners to themselves, and the gold keeps flowing in trade. Impose sovereignty, and it stops. The richest empire of its age was dependent on people it could not govern. and had the wisdom, or at least the experience, to understand that dependency and work within it. So you, as the person at this level, are outside the ladder while simultaneously being the ladder's foundation. You are in the goldfields of Bambouk or Bure, in the hills and river gravels of country that the merchants do not visit and the governors cannot reach. Your life is shaped by knowledge of the ground, by the work of extraction, panning, digging, the reading of the earth for where the gold settles in the river bends, where the veins run in the exposed rock. Your tools are simple, your days are physical. Your world is the immediate one, the river, the family, the community, the work. What reaches you from the great empire to the north is trade, not governance. The merchants' representatives come to the border of your territory, or to some agreed meeting point, and they lay out their goods, salt, cloth, glass beads, copper, brought from the north at great effort and expense. And then they retreat. They sit or they move away. They wait. You emerge. You look at what has been laid out. You leave gold dust or small pieces of worked gold beside the goods you wish to take. And then you retreat. The merchants return, look at what you have left, and either accept it, taking the gold and leaving the goods, or withdraw some of their goods if they consider the exchange unfair, waiting for you to add more gold before the deal closes. No voices, no faces, no shared language necessary, no record of your name or your location, because the location is the thing being kept secret, and meeting face to face is the thing being avoided. This is the silent trade, the dumb barter, and you should know as you listen that it comes to us from outsiders' accounts, from Arab geographers describing what they had been told by merchants who had been near the edges of it, perhaps, or who were repeating what their fathers' trade partners had said. It is possible the silent trade was exactly as described. It is possible it was a stylized account of something more varied and less ceremonially wordless. What the accounts agree on, and what the logic of the situation supports, is the underlying fact: secrecy worked. Whatever form the exchange took, it was arranged to keep the gold-bearer's location and identity unknown to the people they were trading with. And that secrecy was so effective that 8 centuries later, reading the sources, you still cannot give this person a name. What you can say is that their choice, the collective, sustained choice of the gold-producing communities to maintain that veil, was what made everything else possible. The salt that left Taghaza meant nothing without gold to be traded against it. The merchants' careful ledgers meant nothing without the commodity that gave them weight. The governor's tribute meant nothing without gold flowing through the system. The Mansa's legendary wealth, the pavilion, the golden bird, the pilgrimage that would one day stun a city into economic disarray, none of it existed without the anonymous person in the river valley of Bambouk or Bure, kneeling in the gravel of a stream, working. The empire could not conquer you. It bargained with you. And in that bargain, which looks like weakness when you see it from the throne, but looks like extraordinary collective power when you see it from the riverbank, you held the real leverage. The ground held you up. You held up everything above. Let that rest a moment. Let the image settle, the gravel riverbed, the water cold from the highlands, the careful work of hands that knew exactly what they were looking at and chose, every season, to remain unseen. And now the gold moves. Not all of it, not through one channel, but steadily, in aggregate, through the arteries the empire had built to carry it. Northward through the trading towns, into the hands of the merchants, through the tolls and duties that the state collected at the entry and exit points of its territory. and then upward through the administrative structure, tributary and accumulative, until it reached the men whose job was to make sure the flow never stopped and the empire's weight was felt by everyone within its borders. The farba, the farin, the provincial governor. You need to understand the empire's administration not as a modern bureaucracy with departments and files and a civil service, but as a system of relationships and obligations, with tribute flowing up and protection and order flowing down. The Mansa at the centre, the provincial governors in the regions, the local rulers and lineage heads beneath them. Each level owed something to the level above and was owed something in return. What moved upward was gold, goods, captives, labour, military service. What moved downward was the legitimacy that made the whole arrangement hold. The farber's job, in practical terms, was to sit at the intersection of these flows and make sure nothing leaked. He collected tribute from the communities under his authority. He enforced the trade regulations, the duties on salt entering the territory, the taxes on gold leaving it. He maintained order on the roads, which meant keeping the routes passable and the travellers safe and the local powers contained. He sent his portion upward to the Mansa and kept what the arrangement allowed him to keep. Ibn Battuta, who travelled through the empire around 1352 under the reign of Mansa Sulaiman, was struck by what that order produced. He wrote, and this is the line that stays with you across 7 centuries, that a traveller could journey through Mali with no fear of thief or robber. He was a widely travelled man by the time he reached Mali. A Moroccan scholar who had by that point seen most of the Islamic world and a great deal of the rest of it, and he considered safe roads a notable thing worth writing down. They were not guaranteed anywhere. They were the result of sustained governance, of a state that had made it costly enough to rob travellers that most people chose not to. 2,000 kilometres, roughly, from one edge of the empire to the other. A breadth of controlled territory that stretched from the Atlantic-facing regions of what is now Senegal and Mauritania in the west to the Niger Bend and Gao in the east. Across that span, someone could walk, or ride, or lead a laden camel, and the roads were held. The wells were known. The governors were watching. The tribute machine was running. It is easy to overlook that fact, because it is not glamorous in the way that a pilgrimage or a golden pavilion is glamorous. Order does not make a good dramatic image. But for the farmer who needed to reach a market with his grain, for the merchant who needed to arrive at Walata with his salt slabs intact, for anyone who was moving through this empire rather than sitting inside a walled compound, safety was the invisible luxury that made every other exchange possible. Without it, the caravans would have required armed escorts of prohibitive size. Without it, the salt would not have reached the southern markets in enough quantity to drive down its own value. Without it, the gold would not have found its way north in the steady volumes that the empire's reputation depended on. The roads were not incidental to the wealth, they were part of its production. The farber understood this. It was his problem to solve, and his achievement to maintain. Every season, every year, the management of that administrative span, the roads, the tolls, the tribute flow, the resolution of disputes, the deterrence of banditry, was what governance looked like at the provincial level. Not speeches or ceremonies, most days. Accounting, adjudication. The disciplined management of information about what was happening in the territory. What the flows looked like this season compared to last, where the stress points were building. And when the tribute was assembled and the season's accounting complete, it went north and inward toward the capital, toward the court, toward the pavilion and the man who sat within it. The domed pavilion. You have heard it described at a distance, in rumour and in reputation, for as long as you can remember. Everyone in the empire knows it exists. Everyone understands, at least abstractly, what it means. But the court is not where most people go. It is not accessible. The Mansa is not seen by everyone, or even by most. He is approached only through ceremony, which is itself a kind of wall, a series of required forms that make the approach feel earned and make the presence at the centre feel proportionally immense. Ibn Battuta describes it with the precision of a man who took careful notes, or who had a very good memory, or both. The Mansa sat in a large pavilion, a domed structure, and the court assembled before him with great ceremony. The ground was the medium of submission. Those who entered the presence prostrated themselves, faces to the earth, and poured dust or ash over their heads and onto their backs. This was the greeting, the acknowledgement, the visible language of the power differential between the person sitting in the pavilion and the person approaching it. You did not stand upright before the Mansa, you went down. The instruments announced and sustained the court. Great drums, instruments whose sound carried over distances, whose beat organized the ceremony the way a heartbeat organizes a body. The kora was there, or could be, its strings vibrating in the warm air of the gathering, its sound carrying the accumulated memory of every occasion on which it had been played in this place, or one like it. Horns, the whole sonic apparatus of royal presence, designed not simply to be beautiful, but to be heard, and to make the listener feel the weight of what they were approaching. And the golden bird. It sat on top of the pavilion's peak, a finial, an ornament, a statement visible from the outside before you had even entered. Gold-worked, announced from a distance. The symbol of a power that expressed itself through material fact, this is what the wealth of this empire looks like, made physical, elevated, permanent, and impossible to miss. The Mansa himself did not speak to you directly, not because he was absent or inattentive, but because direct speech was not how a man of his position operated within the ceremonial order. There was an interpreter, in the Mande tradition, a spokesman who relayed the king's words to the assembled court and relayed the court's words back to the king. You might think of this as a practical arrangement in a multilingual empire, and it was that. But it was also something older and more structural. The djeli, the griot, the court spokesman, the person who spoke the words that the king generated, was functioning as a kind of medium, a figure whose social role included exactly this, to carry words between levels of power, between the source of authority and the people who needed to receive it. The djeli's voice was not the king's voice. It was an instrument through which the king's meaning moved, amplified and translated and made available to the assembled court. And the king's silence was not a withdrawal from the proceedings, but a form of presence, an authority so complete that it did not need to speak with its own mouth to make itself felt. The words came from a figure standing to the side, chanting or declaiming, and everyone in the court understood they were hearing the Mansa. The indirection was the point. Ibn Battuta observed all of this as an outsider, a man who had grown up in North Africa and travelled to Mali with his own framework for what a ruler's court should look like and how it should function. He was sometimes puzzled by what he saw and sometimes disapproving. He was scandalized by the freedom of women in public life, which reflected his own norms rather than any failing in Malian society. He admired the devotion to prayer and the rigorous Quranic memorization he found in the towns. He was struck by the ceremony of the court, not always with simple admiration, but with the attention of a trained observer who understood he was looking at something that worked on its own terms and according to its own internal logic. His account is the most detailed eyewitness window we have into the court of the Malian Mansas. And that account, read carefully, shows you a place of layered protocol, where every gesture, every spatial arrangement, every mediated communication was designed to concentrate and sustain the impression of power. Power, after all, is partly a fact and partly a performance of a fact. The domed pavilion, the golden bird, the drums, the prostration, the spokesman, all of it was the performance working in concert with the underlying fact of military reach and economic control to produce a shared understanding of what the Mansa was. Now think about the man in the pavilion during the reign that the whole world remembers. Mansa Musa. His reign ran from around 1312 to 1337. He inherited an empire that was already the preeminent power of its region, and he governed it with the combination of administrative skill and dramatic personal gesture that made his name persist across centuries and continents. The administration was the invisible part, the tribute systems, the trade routes, the governors, the secure roads, the accumulated flow of gold and goods from the south. That was the machine. What the world noticed was the gesture. In 1324, Mansa Musa went on pilgrimage to Mecca. The Hajj, the fifth pillar of Islam, the journey every Muslim of means and capability is called to make at least once. He made it in a manner that no individual before or since has replicated in its sheer scale of visible wealth in motion. What we know of the pilgrimage comes from al-Umari, who was recording the memories of Cairo's court officials and scholars roughly 12 years after the event. The numbers in these accounts, tens of thousands of people, thousands of servants, hundreds of camels carrying gold. The details of distribution are second-hand and very possibly inflated by the act of memory and the natural human tendency to make an astonishing thing more astonishing in the telling. So you hold them loosely, as direction rather than precision. But the direction itself is reliable. This was enormous, and the world knew it. The caravan crossed the Sahara and arrived in Egypt, in Cairo, on its way to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And Mansa Musa, moving through that city, distributed gold. He gave it to the officials who received him, to the scholars he visited, to the poor along the roads, to the mosques, to anyone whose hand was extended. He brought his own architects and scholars, and a retinue that, by the accounts of those who witnessed it, was simply staggering in size. Cairo had seen large caravans. It had received important visitors. It had not seen this. The gold he brought into Egypt was, by al-Umari's account, so abundant that its price in the Egyptian markets fell. Gold was the monetary base of the medieval Mediterranean economy. When you flood any market with more of its currency than it can absorb, the value of that currency relative to everything else declines. The price of gold in Egypt reportedly dropped and remained depressed for years afterward. Estimates from the Cairo accounts suggest something like a decade or more before it recovered. This is the detail that makes economic historians sit up, because it is one of the few documented instances in medieval history of a single individual's spending pattern producing a measurable regional economic effect. One man's pilgrimage caused inflation. One man's generosity, expressed at a scale that had nothing to do with generosity as individuals usually experience it, moved the price of the monetary standard across a whole regional economy. Al-Umari was writing 12 years after the event, from the memories of people who had been there and from official accounts circulating in Cairo. The price depression claim is credible. The precise duration and magnitude are harder to pin down. But the underlying mechanism is sound, and you do not need the exact figures to feel the reality of what is being described. What Mansa Musa spent in Egypt was not a personal fortune in any ordinary sense. It was the aggregated product of the entire ladder, the captives' forced march, the farmer's harvest delivered as tribute, the miner's gold panned in the river valley of Bambouk and carried north in secrecy, the merchant's careful transport across the Sahara, the governor's meticulous collection of duties and tolls. All of it, across the whole span of the empire, across the decades, had been accumulating. And when it moved through Cairo in 1324, the movement was large enough to disturb the economy of one of the wealthiest cities in the world. He was not simply rich. He was the visible terminus of a system. Everything beneath him in the ladder, everything we have spent this night tracing from the bottom to the middle to the near top, poured through the person sitting in the domed pavilion and expressed itself in that single pilgrimage as a fact that Cairo never entirely forgot. After Mecca, on the return, Mansa Musa brought back with him the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. The sources credit al-Sahili with building works in the empire, though exactly what he designed and what was already underway before his arrival is a question historians approach with care. What is certain is that during and after Musa's reign, Timbuktu grew. The city on the edge of the Sahara, the trading entrept where the desert met the savanna and where the salt caravans unloaded their slabs and the southbound goods were assembled, this city became something more than a market. It became a center of Islamic scholarship. The Jingereba Mosque, the Sankor Mosque, which eventually became a great center of learning, scholars and students gathering around manuscripts and teachers, building the accumulation of written knowledge that would eventually fill the libraries of Timbuktu with hundreds of thousands of texts on theology, mathematics, astronomy, history, law. The manuscripts were made here, copied here, stored here in conditions the dry Saharan air preserved across centuries. Some of them survive. The knowledge that flowed through this city, south along the trade routes, north with the caravans, into the minds of students who came from the whole of the Islamic world to study at its schools, was another kind of wealth that Mansa Musa's empire generated. Less visible than gold dust, less dramatic than a crashed price in Cairo, but no less real, and in some ways more durable. The texts can still be read. And 50 years after Musa's pilgrimage in 1375, a cartographer in Majorca named Abraham Cresques finished an extraordinary work, the Catalan Atlas, a map of the known world made for the court of the King of Aragon. It is one of the most detailed and beautiful documents of medieval European geography that survives. When Cresques drew the region of West Africa, he placed at its center a figure seated on a throne, crowned, holding in one hand a large gold nugget or orb. The inscription around the figure identified him as the Lord of the Land of the Blacks, Mansa of the Golden Mines. The image is not precise portraiture, it is a cartographer's symbol for the most important fact about this place. The fact that European traders and North African intermediaries and Mediterranean merchants had understood for a century, this is where the gold comes from. Mark it with a man holding gold, because that is what this territory means to anyone sailing or trading or planning routes across the known world. The Catalan Atlas is a T1 document. It survives. The image of the seated king is still there if you look it up, still on the vellum, still holding its gold. European cartographers in 1375 had never been to Mali. They had received the information through long chains of intermediary trade and report. And what they understood well enough to mark it prominently on a map meant for a king was the gold. Always the gold, the thing that the anonymous person in the river valley of Bambouk had pulled from the earth without ever leaving a name. Now let the ladder rest in front of you. Let it stand still for a moment, all its levels visible at once. At the bottom, a captive, the John roped in a line, walking north. The Sahara ahead, the life before captivity behind, the destination unknown and frightening. Feet on the same desert sand that the merchant's camels tread, but on foot, in bondage, without the choice that makes a journey different from an ordeal. This person's movement northward was part of the trade, part of the flow of human capital that moved alongside the salt and the gold and the cloth on the routes between sub-Saharan Africa and the Mediterranean world. Their name is not in the record, their fear is not in the record, not directly. But the fact of their march, witnessed by Ibn Battuta, who travelled in caravans that included enslaved people and who received enslaved people as gifts, is there. Above the captive, the free farmer, the horon of the savanna villages, bound not by rope but by the single rainy season. June arrives, and the sky shifts, and the red earth begins to smell different, and you plant. Sorghum, pearl millet, African rice in the wetter delta land, fonio in the drier patches, cowpeas winding up the stalks of taller plants. You plant because if you do not plant now, in this window, in the right conditions, the year is lost and the granary is empty before the next rains. The iron hoe, the dabba, made by the blacksmith in the forge hut at the edge of the village, moves through the turned earth. The rains come, or they do not come in sufficient measure. The weeds are cleared. The harvest, when it arrives in the dry season, is what you have. A portion of it moves upward, as tribute, as obligation, as the cost of living within a structure that also keeps the roads safe and the soldiers from taking more than the customary share. Above the farmer, the artisan castes, the Nyamakala, sitting at a strange angle to the rest of the social order. The blacksmith, the Numu, feared and necessary, master of fire and iron, maker of the hoe that the farmer needs and the spear that the soldier carries and the tools that the whole economy depends on. The leatherworker, the Garanki, stitching the cases that hold the Quranic verses, the saddles that make the horse useful in war, the sheaths that keep the blades safe and available. These people marry within their own caste. A smith marries a smith's daughter. A leatherworker's children marry into leatherworking families. Because the caste is not merely an occupation, but an identity, a set of relationships with Nyama, the vital force that runs through everything, that is especially concentrated in transformative work, and in words, and in the thresholds between states. The smith transforms raw metal into shaped tool. The griot transforms raw experience into preserved memory. Both stand at a threshold. Both are set apart. The djeli, the griot, the living library. Hereditary keeper of the lineages, singer of the histories, speaker of the words the king will not say with his own mouth. Trained from childhood in the epic of Sunjata, in the genealogies of the ruling families, in the art of praise that sustains a powerful person's sense of their own continuity with the past. The kora in hand, the balafon's wooden keys struck to make the music that accompanies the recitation, the ngoni's strings under the fingers that have been learning this instrument since they were small. The tradition of the Soso Bala, the great balafon that legend says was taken from the sorcerer king Sumanguru Kant at the Battle of Kirina. This is the founding moment the griots carry, the story of Sunjata Keita and the beginning of the empire, told in T3 as living truth, understood by the historian as cultural document rather than literal chronicle, but no less important for that distinction. The Koyat lineage, claiming descent from Balafask, Sunjata's own griot, maintaining across centuries the thread of memory that makes a people feel continuous with their own past. The griot is the person who makes the ladder legible to itself. The merchant on the salt gold route arriving at Walata with his load, recording the tolls paid at the state's checkpoints, calculating the margin between what the salt cost him in the north and what it will bring in the south, where a body working in heat needs salt the way it needs water, and where the absence of natural deposits makes what the desert produces into something close to treasure. The desert crossing in his memory, the cold nights, the guide's confidence or its lack, the camel's complaints, the well that was dry and the well that was not, the stars used for navigation in the stretches between known landmarks, the arrival at Timbuktu, the unloading, the scholars in the mosque, the call to prayer hanging in the dry air, the smell of dust and trade, and the faint saline ghost of the salt slabs stacked in the warehouses. The governor, the farber, at his checkpoint, counting goods entering, duty paid, gold leaving, duty paid. Tribute assembled from the communities under his watch and forwarded, in the proper season, to the centre. The roads under his administration holding safe, because the order is not decorative, but functional. Because a robbed merchant is a merchant who does not come back next season, and the tolls go uncollected, and the tribute falls short, and the Mansa's court notices the gap. Order is profitable. Safety is a managed output of governance, and the gold miner, nameless, located somewhere in the river valleys of Bambuk or Bure, unknown to the merchant and unknown to the governor, and deliberately kept that way, leaving gold beside goods in the transaction that has no words and no faces. The silent trade, reported and probably real and certainly purposeful, carrying the whole economy in the patient hands of someone who understood exactly what they had and what it was worth, and what would happen if they let the empire get too close. And at the top, the man in the pavilion, the Mansa, the one who did not speak with his own mouth to anyone below him, and to whom the whole world prostrated themselves when they came into his presence. The golden bird on top of the dome catching the light, the drums whose sound carried the ceremony, the spokesman's voice carrying the king's meaning outward, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Mansa Musa, sitting in that pavilion sometime in the 1320s, understanding, because he had said so to the people who told al-Umari that the goldfields could not be conquered, only bargained with, that the source of his extraordinary wealth was beyond his direct reach, maintained by the secrecy of people he would never meet and could not govern. The richest man of his age, dependent on arrangements he did not control, managing an empire whose complexity exceeded any single person's capacity to understand it fully. When he stood up from that pavilion in 1324 and led his caravan north across the Sahara and through Egypt and across the Red Sea to Mecca, he was carrying with him the product of everything below. The captives' forced labour that had built and maintained the trade routes and mines, the farmers' grain that fed the soldiers who kept the routes safe, the blacksmith's iron that equipped those soldiers and that turned the earth for the farmers, the griot's memory that kept the lineages coherent and the king's legitimacy intact across generations. The merchant's careful navigation of the desert that moved the salt south and the gold north. The governor's disciplined collection that funneled it all to the center. The silent miner's gold, never quite possessed by the empire and yet completely essential to it. All of it, all of these lives, moving through the pavilion and out into the world as the gold that fell on Cairo and depressed a market and stayed in the memory of that city's scholars long enough for Al-Umari to write it down, long enough for it to reach the cartographers of Majorca, long enough to mark a spot on a vellum map as the place where a man sits holding gold. The ladder did not make a hero. It made a fact. And the fact was large enough to bend an economy and survive 8 centuries and reach this moment, this night, and land quietly in your mind as something understood rather than simply known. The captive walked north, and the farmer bent over the earth, and the smith raised his hammer, and the griot opened his mouth, and the merchant loaded his camel, and the miner left gold beside goods in the silence of a riverbank. And the governor counted, and the tribute moved upward, and the Mansa sat in his pavilion as the golden bird caught the morning light on the peak of a dome in a city that longer stands in a form archaeologists can find with certainty. And all of it, all the fear, all the labour, all the secrecy and the skill and the seasonal risk and the desert cold and the morning smell of wood smoke over a savanna village at the start of a rainy season, all of it made one number in one register that one traveller wrote down and sent north to become legend. And the legend outlasted the empire itself. The Songhai eventually absorbed what Mali had built, inheriting the trade routes and the cities and the scholars and the slow rhythm of the Saharan commerce. The empire of Mali thinned and contracted over the century after Musa, returning to something closer to its Manding heartland. Timbuktu's scholarship continued. The griots kept reciting. The farmers kept watching the sky in June. The castes kept their work, generation after generation, the knowledge passing from hands to hands inside the closed circles of the endogamous lineages. The gold country kept its secrets, the desert kept its dead, and its survivors, and its cold stars. What the empire left, in the end, was not territory. Territory shifts. What it left was the memory carried in the sources and in the tradition, the eyewitness account of Ibn Battuta noting the safety of roads and the ceremony of courts. The second-hand wonder of Al-Umari transcribing Cairo's astonishment. The surviving vellum of the Catalan Atlas with its seated king and his gold. The epic of Sunjata still performed, still sung. The balafon still struck in the old patterns, the lineages still known to the families who kept them. History rarely hands you a complete thing. What you get are these fragments, a court official's memory, a traveller's notes, a cartographer's symbol, an instrument still guarded in Guinea, a manuscript still stored in a library in Timbuktu, and from the fragments you reconstruct, imperfectly, the shape of something that was once whole and is now mostly silence. But the silence has a shape. And the shape, traced carefully, starting at the bottom and climbing slowly toward the golden bird on the peak of the pavilion, tells you something true about how large things are built from small ones, how legends are the distilled product of ordinary lives, how one man's extraordinary wealth was not a miracle but the visible top of a very long ladder. Every rung of that ladder was a life. Every life was a daily rhythm, the weight of the hoe, the heat of the forge, the cold of the desert night, the sound of the kora beginning the recitation, the taste of millet porridge with dried fish and a sauce of baobab leaves, the rough texture of a salt slab, the cold water of a river in the goldfields, the boom of a great drum announcing the beginning of ceremony. Those lives are gone in their particularity. The farmer whose name is not recorded, the miner whose location was never written down, the captive whose journey is documented only as a category in a traveller's account, these people lived fully, in all the texture and difficulty and small satisfaction that living involves, and what we have of them now is the outline, the function they served in a system, the category they occupied in a social order. That is a loss. But the outline is still something. The category is still a person. And spending a night tracing those lives from the bottom to the top, arriving, finally, at the golden bird and the crashed price and the vellum map is a way of returning something, however small, to the people who were always beneath the legend and always, invisibly, its source. The Niger still moves through the same delta, the Sahara still turns cold at night and burning by midday, and the stars are still there, still usable for navigation if you know them. Somewhere in the hills and river country of what is now Guinea and Senegal, the earth still holds the traces of the gold country that the empire could never quite possess. And in Timbuktu, in collections that have survived fire and flood and neglect and war, some of the manuscripts that Mansa Musa's patronage helped bring into being are still there, still legible, still holding the words that scholars set down in the city on the desert's edge, while the kora played in the courtyard and the salt caravans unloaded in the square, and the city was, for a moment in history, the place where the world's knowledge and the world's wealth met and made something worth remembering. This is where we have been. This night, the whole ladder, from the roped foot in the desert to the golden bird on the dome. From the river gravel and the anonymous hand to the pavilion, and the man who would not speak with his own mouth. From the first rains in June over a savanna field to the gold falling like slow rain over Cairo. You have climbed it, you have felt the weight of every rung, and now it can settle, all of it, the whole vertical distance of it, into the quiet place where things understood come to rest. Not forgotten, not pressing for attention. Simply known, the way the things you carry closest to you are known, without effort, without searching, just there, present and calm. The desert is cold tonight. Somewhere the stars are the same ones the guides used. The river is moving through the delta the way it has always moved, the water spreading and contracting with the seasons, the fish running in the channels, the rice growing in the shallows. Somewhere a djeli remembers, in the way the memory runs deepest, the old words, the old names, the beginning of the song. Nothing left to do now but be calm and drift